Good morning. Welcome to another session of hashtag LDeduchat, Leadership Development in Education Online. Today we have John Rees from PSHE Solutions, who will be looking at the impact of PSHE on school improvement. So again, just follows that narrative of everything that we're trying to do. We're trying to have a look at it as a whole school approach to how do we improve the cultures in our school, and PSHE is an integral part of that. We'll be diving into his recorded session and then doing a live Q&A. On Twitter today, we have Adam Holdsworth from Hitchin, who will be doing our Twitter takeover. So make sure you jump on there. It's at Chiltern TSA, at Chiltern TSA. Follow us and join in the discussion on there as well. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of links that will be sent out during and after the session that John will be discussing. Just before we do jump in, we've got a special session running on Thursday, and it's for Black Lives Matter, anti-racism. It's a whole school responsibility. We've got an extraordinary panel of people from curriculum and leadership that will be looking at what actual steps can schools take to address the issues that have come up in the last few weeks, and obviously the issues that some of us have been dealing with for many years. So it should be a lively debate. It's at 11:30, running for an hour and a half. So do look out for that. And we really would value your attendance on that and your engagement on the webinar, and also on Twitter as well that day. So without further ado, we'll be moving straight into John's session to do with PSHE and school improvement, and we'll join the live debate afterwards.
Hi, my name is John Rees. My background is in education. I started life as a slim and curly-haired young PE teacher. It was quite a long time ago now. I was a member of the senior leadership team at a secondary school in Devon, and then spent 12 years at Exeter University leading the development of a sex and relationships education programme that engaged schools across the UK and overseas. For the last 15 years or so, I've been an independent educational coach and trainer, focusing on school improvement, especially through personal, social, health and economic education. Whether you're watching this live or on catch-up, please don't hesitate to get in touch if there's anything I can do to support you or your school in terms of promoting outcomes for pupils or, of course, staff through the development of high-quality PSHE. I'm going to talk you through a PowerPoint that I prepared, and then we'll have time for some questions and answers. So whenever you watch this, please do use the Twitter handles and the hashtag LDeduchat. The majority of my presentation will focus on the needs of schools in England, but I would argue that the principles remain the same wherever you teach. Children who are starting school this year are probably going to join the labour market when? It's extraordinary to think, isn't it, that some children are not going to leave school until 2038, and probably even longer if they're staying on at university. So the majority will probably retire, well, some teachers would say never, as it keeps moving ahead of us, but sometime in the 2080s. And of course we hope that most children are going to live into the 22nd century. I think it's going to be the topic of a whole nother webinar, but a question about, is our current curriculum and some of the assessment processes really fit for purpose? Is it really likely to equip children and young people who are going to live into the 22nd century with stuff that they need? A long time ago, the then QCA, the Qualifications Curriculum Authority, said there were two things that the curriculum should provide. The first is, of course, learning and achievement, and I have no problem with that at all, but they also said that of equal importance was the spiritual, moral, social and cultural development. And whatever your politics, it's a nonsense to separate children's social emotional development from their academic learning. And of course, as the QCA, and this was reinforced by the National Curriculum documentation, these two aims reinforce each other, and development in both areas is absolutely essential to improving standards and outcomes for children. And this is reflected in the latest Ofsted framework. I think it's really important to remind ourselves that Ofsted say that the inspectors must use all the evidence. So everything that we do within PSHE and then across the curriculum in SMSC should be contributing to this. And then, of course, before they make their final judgment on overall effectiveness, things like SMSC and pupils' personal social health development is absolutely crucial. If you're interested in SMSC, there is a national SMSC quality mark which is available from the charity Young Citizens. It was the Citizenship Foundation. It's a really simple self-assessment, and then you can have an external verification if you really wish. Slide 6. I think this is a really interesting piece of evidence from Robin Banerjee and his colleagues at Sussex University. Now, the conventional wisdom is, of course, where there is more free school meals, the children do less well. At least that's the perceived, as I say, common understanding. Banerjee's got a whole bank of research and evaluation stuff that looks at what we mean by ethos, but he points out that where the ethos is poor, children don't do too well. Where the ethos, where we get all these things right, the critical non-essentials, where the SMSC is really happening, then the line doesn't quite flatten out, but it certainly makes a big difference. Now, within the policy context for relationships and sex and health education, as you can see, there's a long list, and you might be relieved that I'm not going to talk through all of them. I do just want to mention the Equality Act, and of course then focus on relationships and sex and health education and the latest guidance from the DfE. I think it's really important that we remind ourselves that the Equality Act and the Public Sector Equality Duty says that we have to eliminate discrimination, harassment, victimisation and any other conduct. It's essential, presumably after break, we have to then advance the quality of the opportunity between people. And not only do we have to do that, but our statutory responsibility is really to foster good relationships between people, those who share a protected characteristic and those who don't. Now, where else in the curriculum is this going to happen, apart from PSHE? Actually, it should be happening everywhere, but I think that very easily gets overlooked and forgotten. I think it's a really interesting piece of research from a few years ago from Gutman and Vorhaus. I suppose, like a lot of good research, it told us some of what we already knew. If children struggle to attend or pay attention, then they don't achieve so much. If they have disruptive behaviour, well, we knew that. Being bullied, yeah, we knew that. Greater schooling, yeah, we knew that. This is really interesting. Schools can boost achievement by encouraging pupils' enjoyment at school, building positive friendships. So actually, when children have good social and emotional development at primary school, it enables them to do better at secondary school. Now, I would see very little difference between Key Stage 2 and into Key Stage 3. So if you're looking at developing good GCSE outcomes, I would suggest that building positive friendships and their emotional and behavioural well-being is absolutely crucial. Quite a few years ago, the Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, produced her annual report, and she talked about how PSHE is vitally important. She described how it supports children's early learning goals, the developmental goals, and enables them to successfully negotiate the health behaviours. She talked about forming a bridge, and the idea that PSHE is a virtuous circle, I think, is really important. So it's not only about improving pupils' health and well-being, but enabling them to achieve better academic success, and of course then there starts, as I say, a virtuous spiral which leads to improved outcomes for them, whatever they're doing. If you're not familiar with this joint publication between Public Health England and the National Association of Head Teachers, I would strongly commend it to you. It does what it says on the tin. It talks about the links between pupil health and well-being and their attainment. And there is case study after case study after case study of where we can get it right in terms of pupils' health and well-being, improving their attainment. And of course it has to be that way round. Just because they attain really highly doesn't necessarily mean that they're happier and healthier. If we can get the health and well-being stuff right, then attainment improves. The PSHE Association, along with, as you can see, a number of other organisations a couple of years ago, produced this case for statutory PSHE. And there's really strong research evidence to show the impacts, the positive impacts that PSHE can have on physical and mental health, keeping children physically and emotionally safe, improving their financial awareness, and we know that's got a huge knock-on effect on pupils' mental health and their ability to succeed and thrive and flourish. Really important links with careers awareness, and of course links to their academic attainment. Many people will know of the research from the Education Endowment Foundation, who talk about the importance of social and emotional learning. And then of course metacognition, that's learning how to learn, and emotional self-regulation. It's probably one of the most powerful things we can do for kids. Now whether that's in the taught curriculum slot called PSHE or right the way across the curriculum through SMSC, I'm not too bothered. But I suppose the really important bit is where we can get this stuff right, where pupils' emotional well-being and their physical and mental health are well, it underpins their learning and attainment. If you teach in primary schools, I think there's a really another really important piece of research from the Education Endowment Foundation. I'm not going to read the words to you, but the link is there, and I would strongly recommend having a look at that as you develop your PSHE. Early in 2020, the PSHE Association updated their programme of study, And they were very clear, they're quite helpful I think in terms of reminding us that PSHE is a really important subject. It's about helping children manage their lives now, and in Ofsted I think it talks about the responsibilities of later life. And of course it's not just in later life when they get to secondary school or post-16. For some kids, later life means this weekend. So PSHE is also about helping children and young people stay healthy and safe. But when it's taught well, PSHE also helps children to achieve their academic potential. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this is now being recognised by DfE. We do have some guidance on this. It was written in the last century. Now, I exaggerate for effect, but in 2000, the Department for Education and Employment produced their guidance on sex and relationships education. Now, to put that in some historical context, those of you who are fans of Coronation Street will remember the Free Deirdre Barlow campaign was going on. For people who perhaps aren't quite so old, the Spice Girls and the Teletubbies were doing their thing, and Blue Peter was burying a time capsule in what became the O2 Centre. And if that's what your mobile phone looked like, I suppose the important thing is that the world has moved on significantly and we desperately needed new guidance. So here is the new guidance on relationships and sex and health education. And although I'm fairly critical of quite a lot of government policy, I think this idea of helping children and young people flourish has got to be a good thing. I'm all for flourishing. Again, they're making the links between supporting their own and others' well-being and their attainment. And surely it's a good thing all round to help young people become successful and happy adults who make a meaningful contribution to society. Again, I think there's a slight cautionary note. If you're looking at developing your relationships and sex and health education, and that's all you do, if you just go for a minimum compliance, I think we're unlikely to meet some of the needs that children are going to have. Now, this was true even before the COVID crisis hit us. But there's nothing in there about a loss and bereavement, and I would argue very strongly that we do need to sensitively teach those things to children and young people and allow them to explore the issues. Or even, as I say, when I was a slim and curly-haired geography teacher, if one of my students gets dumped a fortnight before GCSEs, I know it's really important that somebody's done some work earlier with them, that they recognise the world will continue to turn and they can get through their GCSE geography, because that's really important to me. There's some really important stuff that it also doesn't cover about careers education, and it doesn't include personal finance. Now, they say that that'll be picked up in maths. Well, that remains to be seen. Let's have a quick look at the curriculum content then. Through Key Stage 1 to 4, children and young people will have to learn about these things, and in an age-appropriate way. I think it's absolutely right, isn't it? They need to understand what mental health is. Now, that'll look different if you're teaching 6-year-olds than 16-year-olds, but internet safety and harms all the way through has got to be a good thing. And then the usual suspects that we've been talking about within PSHE for many years, around healthy eating, drugs and alcohol and so forth, is really important. In Key Stage 1 and 2, children have to learn about relationships education, and quite sensibly, again, people in primary schools will be teaching these things for a long time. Families and people who care for me, caring friendships, respectful relationships. Primary schools, of course, then have to choose whether or not they teach sex education. And although the DfE guidance doesn't really give us a clear steer on what sex education is, the conventional wisdom really seems to be about how babies are made and born. Now, a primary school may choose not to teach that, possibly for very good reasons. Personally, I would argue against it. Young people grow up in an incredibly sexualised world, whether that's movies, YouTube, a couple of clicks away on the internet. We need to teach children to navigate this sexualised world. And then in Key Stage 3 and 4, relationships and sex education is going to be statutory, so we need to make sure that we're getting this as right as we possibly can for our young people. Having produced that guidance, the DfE then in February 2020 produced some additional, now this is non-statutory guidance, but they said that we really should locate our statutory components of relationships and sex and health education within a wider framework of PSHE. In June 2020, the DfE produced some more guidance, really as a result, quite sensibly, of the coronavirus crisis. They said that as from September 2020, that relationships and sex and health education, just as we knew it should be, was still going to be compulsory. But I think very sensibly they are giving schools some leeway, so that from September 2020 to the end of the spring term in 2021, we can still continue to develop our curriculum. Although, obviously, if you're ready to go for it, start it as soon as possible. And of course, many primary schools have been doing this stuff very well for a long time. We can still use those two terms, if you like, to develop the curriculum, and the absolutely essential part, not only of engaging parents in the policy development, but helping take them on that journey is absolutely crucial. So that by the start of the summer term 2021, we should be ready to teach these. I think it's also really important to remind ourselves that let's say in a secondary school, the needs of the current Year 11 might be quite different from the needs that the Year 11 students will have in 4 or 5 years' time. If you're just starting to teach relationships and sex and health education, hopefully the children will develop knowledge and skills and some values clarification, and as that rolls through the secondary phase, the needs of the Year 11 students in 4 or 5 years' time could be quite different from that which you've got at the moment. So we're going to have to continue to adapt and change and evolve our curriculum as things improve. Let's have a look then at the links that we have between PSHE and other aspects of the curriculum. So here we've got our relationships, possibly with sex education, and our health education should be sitting within a wider framework of PSHE. And of course then, if we're doing some economic education, the government said that should link very clearly to the maths curriculum. And of course that links to citizenship, although that's not statutory in primary schools. Inevitably, a lot of health education links to PE, and of course when we're teaching about the changing adolescent body, there'll be links to science. If we're teaching about online safety, there are going to be links to the computing curriculum. And of course, there's a vast amount of stuff that can be done through story and looking at relationships education through English. Relationships in history always haven't been particularly good, but I think there are strong links there. And of course, if we're looking at art and interpretations of media, that's a really powerful link with PSHE. And of course, healthy eating and food technology, whatever age you're teaching your pupils, there are strong links there with our PSHE. Of course, that all sits within a wider framework of careers-related learning. It links to our extracurricular activities and the spiritual, moral, social and cultural development. So let's have a think about what young people need. Of course they need knowledge and understanding. Now, I'm not going to get into a false dichotomy debate about whether it's knowledge or skills, but you can't make informed decisions if you've got inaccurate knowledge. If you think that drinking a can of Monster and a couple of packets of Doritos on the way to school is a good diet or a good breakfast, you need some knowledge about that. But we know that knowledge on its own is not enough. Young people do need to put that knowledge into practice. There's no point in doing all the anti-bullying work and singing the anti-bullying song and dancing the anti-bullying dance and even doing a PowerPoint presentation about it and then going out and be horrible to other kids in the playground. And I would also suggest that we need to think about some of the virtues, the attitudes and personal attributes that children and young people have, because that drives a lot of what we do. So our PSHE really should be located within the centre of those 3 Venn diagrams. And of course, in the DFE guidance, we've got a lot about relationships on and offline, about physical health, about mental health, about friendships, families, and the changing adolescent body through puberty. And then they've also given us, although it often doesn't appear on the list, quite a long list of things that we should also be developing, those personal values or attributes around honesty, integrity, courage, and so forth. And I would argue then, we need to develop the skills of empathy and compassion and presentation skills, being able to talk to each other, confidence, assertiveness, those whole kind of interpersonal skills, those so-called soft skills that a lot of people will say are particularly difficult, an ability to resist peer pressure. Now, I appreciate that this has big implications when we're thinking about assessment. It's relatively easy to do a knowledge-based assessment around some of the learning they've done, but that isn't going to be the bit that keeps them safe or enables them to have strong interpersonal skills, which of course then lead into employability. I would suggest this then needs a different style of pedagogy. Traditionally, and I worry increasingly, we've come from a knowledge-based approach where the teacher has all the understanding, whether it's about how to do long division or quadratic equations or oxbow lakes, whatever it might be. We've got to get it out of my head and into the learner's head so they can regurgitate it one hot afternoon. I would suggest that PSHE is more about education in terms of drawing from. Now, I could explain to children how I sorted out this problem in 1963 in black and white with 2 channels on the telly. It might be of limited value to children and young people today. I think it's really important we think about the pedagogy that we're encouraging kids. We've got to give them the knowledge and information, of course, but then we can explore the issues. So it's absolutely essential that we create a safe and appropriate learning environment, and we use distancing techniques. How could he deal with this? How could she respond to that? What if it was two boys? What if they came from this faith group? What if their parents wanted them to do? So we can explore the issues, not in a morally neutral vacuum, but in a way that encourages children to arrive at some of the pro-social, pro-health choices that we would like them to make. Incidentally, if you're interested in inviting visitors into the classroom, I would strongly recommend Primary Futures, and there's a parallel for secondary schools. You can see the YouTube link there. It's gorgeous. But Primary Futures provides a free website where you can find volunteers. So if Year 3 are doing something on the water cycle, you can look on the website and find a volunteer to come in from industry, or you can do something on people who help us. And of course, there's a parallel program for secondary schools called Engaging the Future. I know that a lot of people have been very concerned about the best way to tackle introducing these so-called new subjects of health education and relationships and sex education. Of course, as the DfE recognised, many primary, secondary and special schools have been doing this very well for a long period of time. But if you do have any concerns, please do have a look at the work of the PSHE Association. They've produced, with the support of the teaching unions and the Sex Education Forum, this really helpful interactive resource which you can download for free and then use as the basis of your policy and leadership development to make sure that not only you're covering all the bases and the statutory expectations, but you're locating that within a wider framework of high quality PSHE. For the last couple of years, ever since the DfE made the announcement about statutory relationships and sex and health education, some schools have been very concerned about how to get it right about mental health and supporting the emotional well-being of children and young people, and of course the staff. Now, I know there's a wealth of resources out there, and sometimes very expensive, but if you're not a member of the PSHE Association, I would strongly recommend anybody leading on this is a member. Please do contact your local authority PSHE advisor or your public health team to make sure that your resources come from a trusted and reputable source such as Halcyon Education. Let's just have a think about some of the benefits of high quality PSHE. So within PSHE we would aim to improve those things, our usual things that I've just been talking about: friendships, respectful relationships, healthy eating, first aid and understanding the adolescent body. So what are some of the potential impacts? Well, I would suggest if children are better able to get on with each other and they're better able to collaborate and cooperate in groups, that's going to be good for their learning in science and English and elsewhere in the curriculum. If they're more comfortable with their own physical and online safety, they're more emotionally secure, less distracted, less disturbed, perhaps they're better able to concentrate because they've got better sleep patterns, that's going to be really important. Their emotional well-being, their mental health, to be able to manage their emotions, to understand what's happening, some of the feelings that they have, and we know those can be incredibly intense during early adolescence and into adolescence. We know from the Education Endowment Foundation that emotional self-regulation and self-care are absolutely crucial to physical well-being and mental well-being, but of course to learning as well. If children are eating more healthily and they've got an improved diet, well, that's got to be a good thing. Talked about better sleep, better dental hygiene and possibly less time off school. I think if you've ever done a first aid course, that sense of self-reliance is really powerful. And if children have a better understanding of some of the changes that are going to happen to them, and of course we need to reassure them these changes are entirely normal to happen at the age of 8 or 9, and some girls will be starting their periods then, but it's equally normal not to have started any aspect of puberty perhaps until you're 15. And that's a really tough concept to get across to children and young people. But if we have reduced levels of anxiety, improved self-worth, improved self-confidence, that's got to be good for learning. I suppose the bottom line is that healthier, happier children learn better. Of course, if that's all going on for pupils, what might the potential impact be on staff well-being and their retention and recruitment? Having said all that, I think we have to acknowledge some of the challenges that are going to be faced over the next year or two. We've got a whole bunch of stuff going on about Black Lives Matters. We've got all the stuff around immigration and some really, I think, ugly and uncomfortable messages that children will be exposed to in person or on social media or just on the news. We know that some of the race riots, some of the troubles, the potential civic disruption that we're seeing at the moment can be really unsettling, and we need to engage young people to be able to get them to think about that, to manage that, and to think about their appropriate response. We know that as children re-emerge, schools reopen still further from post-COVID, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff around mental health, emotional well-being, not just immediately. It might not be until the anniversary of Grandad's death, or until Mum and Dad's business, which has kind of stumbled on okay for a few months or years, then goes belly up. How are we supporting our pupils as they experience some of those anxieties that I fear will rumble on for a long time? And of course, if that's happening for our children and young people, and it's happening for our families, that's also happening to our staff. How are we supporting them through the anniversaries and the crises and the emotional distress that so many people will be feeling, not just now, but in the weeks and months ahead? So we need, I think, to be focusing on mental health. It's curious, isn't it, just at a time when we're introducing statutory PSHE, which should have a component of mental health. I think there is a real win-win to be done there. Where do pupils learn about relationships? Well, a lot of the time it's how they're modelled. And I would suggest they will know very well on the staff. Kids will know who you like and who you don't get on with quite so well. But I think how we model those relationships with our colleagues, with people in the office, with our support assistants, that's absolutely crucial. And if children and young people forever see us stressed and busy and overworked and overwhelmed emotionally, that's not a good look either. How we look after ourselves and how we model this for children and young people is absolutely crucial. How do you recognise a teacher? Yeah, that's a slightly uncomfortable image, isn't it? So please look after yourself and look after your colleagues. You can't do this if you're not physically and emotionally well. You can't do this from a hospital bed. As a friend of mine says, please put your own oxygen mask on first. So there we are then. That's the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I'm looking forward to the questions and discussions we're going to have now. But as I said at the start, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to get in touch at any stage in the future. And if there's anything I can do to support you or your school improve outcomes for children and young people, and of course the staff, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Welcome back. And again, we don't plan this in terms of speaking to each speaker and try and carry a thread through everything that we do. I think the power of having people like John with us is the fact that the messages are so strong from all the speakers that we've had, and there seems to be a common thread that runs through everything that we do. So what I'd like to do is introduce John Rees from PSHE Solutions to the East stage, and thank you so much for putting that together. I mean, to be fair, I mean, I've done quite a lot on PSHE, and I'm sitting here making notes myself in terms of just the emphasis that's within from the framework, but also in terms of just from a moral purpose point of view, the things that we have to consider. And I found it absolutely fascinating. I watched some of it last night, and I saved watching it properly this morning because I wanted to get the same feelings that people joining our session were getting. But a lot to unpack on that. We have had some questions through, so if you have got some questions, do pose them. And some of the ones that you have answered, thank you, John, definitely need exploring more. Because I think, like with anything with PSHE, we could talk about it all day, every day of our school lives. But just to remind people that we are on Twitter as well. We've got Adam on Twitter doing our Twitter takeover. That's Adam Holdsworth from Hitchin, and that's at Chiltern TSA. And I think this will be one of those sessions that really needs to be used by people that are line managing PSHE to give PSHE a platform to staff that perhaps have got different confidence levels about delivering PSHE. I think it's a really good watch this, and this will tell you why we do this, would be really, really good. And especially for NQTs and NQT plus ones that are getting more and more involved with delivering PSHE, I think is a really good embodiment of why we do PSHE. So thank you, John, for putting that together, and welcome. If you want to say hi to our lovely attendees this morning.
Good morning to all the lovely attendees.
So where do you want to start, John? I know that you've earmarked a couple of questions, and I know that you've answered some. Which question did you want to start with?
I think probably the important starting point is probably some of the questions I'm assuming have been based on secondary expectations. So when we're talking about specialist teams, I would argue that's really important within secondary if we possibly can. But as I said in reply to somebody, just because somebody's got a couple of spare periods on their timetable doesn't necessarily make them a specialist. And I know that's a model that some schools have had to follow. I would certainly include primary colleagues within this who then have to teach, everything across the curriculum. Henrietta asked a really interesting question saying, I'm a science teacher, we teach healthy eating, we teach about healthy eating, but children still eat several packets of crisps. I think healthy eating is a really hard thing to do, partly because kids often don't have a lot of choice about what they just simply get to eat what they are given. But I suppose part of the difference is perhaps picked up in what I was trying to say about pedagogy. I think there's a danger that a lot of staff will kind of have this knowledge that they have to then disseminate and tell children, and that's not helped by a DFE structure that talks about by the end of secondary and primary, children must know, children must know, children must know. So we have a very knowledge-heavy curriculum. But as I also said, simply knowing something isn't enough. Otherwise, there'd be no overweight doctors or there'd be no doctors who smoke. I think it's really important wherever we can to engage the pupils in that and think about, so what are the alternatives? Now, for science staff, I think that then becomes really tricky because they've got a whole bus full of stuff to get through and deliver. So I sympathise with that, but I think there are ways perhaps of linking science and PSHE so that if I'm giving the information within science and we're doing that, maybe we can continue those conversations on in PSHE to say, well, how could somebody respond to that? What if they didn't want to do that? What else could somebody eat? And then linked to all of that, one of the things I didn't mention, and how much can you say in half an hour, is that there's a really important notion around we do what we do because that's what's expected of us. So nobody said, John, if you're talking on the, recording this thing for TSA Chiltern, wear a smart shirt rather than your gardening shorts, which I may well have underneath. I'm not going to reveal that. But I think there's something really important about we do what we do because that's what's expected of us. I think there's some really powerful stuff around social norms that we can, first of all, the DFE quite rightly are saying we should interpret and then adapt our curriculum according to local needs. So if I'm doing a survey with young people, particularly in secondary school, to look at local needs and then adapting the curriculum to respond to those needs, are there some social norms messages that I can feed back? So, for example, the numbers of young people who smoke in many parts of the country is minimal. And yet it's very easy to assume that lots of kids smoke. But if I'm 14 and I know, in inverted commas in my head, that everybody at the age of 16 is smoking and having sex and drinking alcohol, the truth is that they're not. But it's very easy to assume that. And there may be ways of doing surveys with students and then feeding back those results, which help us to adapt our curriculum, but help to inform young people around most people aren't having sex, or 9 out of 10 of our students choose not to smoke. And I'm conscious that that's become an incredibly long and rambling answer.
No. I think it's an absolutely valid point. And I think as subject specialists, we deal with misconceptions on a day-to-day basis in our lessons, and we search for those misconceptions so we can address those, correct those, however we choose to do that within our teaching and learning. And I think sometimes we don't apply the same mechanism within PSHE, which kind of links to this whole idea about whether people should be specialists or whether we should become specialists because that's part of our moral purpose, and that balance between the two in terms of how much time is invested in putting together a PSHE program, and then how relevant it is to who we're delivering it to. So, that's one of the things that, and I'm glad that you said about the context of your school being the way that you adapt it, because I think part of the new framework is the fact that how relevant is what you're teaching, and that includes PSHE, to your ethos, to your culture, and to your cohort. So from that point of view, I think it goes absolutely hand in hand. And I think we miss that sometimes, having taught PSHE for the last 13, 14 years, and every single subject you can think of, having to deliver sexual relationships to a group of 13-year-old mixed ability students from a deprived area was a challenging one. And a lot of people said, no, they don't feel comfortable delivering it. And I think some of the questions come born out of that. So how do we, what's your view on that in terms of specialist, non-specialist, or schools developing specialists? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think Dylan Williams' comment about anything can work somewhere, but nothing works everywhere, it's that sort of stuff, I think is really powerful. Personally, I think specialist teams, if they genuinely are specialists, people who've opted to develop an expertise, and it probably is that, because as I say, I started life as a PE and special needs teacher. I think where people do develop an interest or an expertise, we can foster that. That's probably a longer term solution, and some schools will find that very difficult to do, particularly in secondary. So if necessary, secondary, I think philosophically, I think that all teachers are teachers of PSHE, whether they like it or not. But I'm thinking, a couple of questions about the secondary colleagues there. If we've got all our tutors being specialists, or in inverted commas being teachers of PSHE, they need a lot of CPD. They need confidence. The thought of having to go into the classroom would say words like penis and vagina are incredibly challenging for some people. I think, as I say, it's developing a different expertise, and there's almost a curiousness that we can develop to say to young people, look, it's not about me or you, and we need to establish ground rules. So I'm not going to make personal comments. No, that would be really important in the primary area. So even just questions like, so have you ever been drunk then? Have you ever tried an illegal drug? Those are not questions I think are appropriate for me to disclose or even to talk about. So I'm not going to put myself on the spot. I think we need to we've all seen those cowboy films, for example, where somebody puts a hat on a stick and sees who shoots at it. And I think that notion, we know that happens in staff meetings. So the notion of saying to young people, here's a scenario, how could he deal with this? How could she respond to that? What if they came from what if their parents, we can explore it from the safety of the third person. So it's important that all staff can do that, that we have the confidence and the expertise to be able to manage those questions, to keep the learning environment safe, but also to have our antenna very finely tuned, that if young people do even hint at a disclosure, then we know the referral ways to link that to the designated safeguarding lead or the designated lead for mental health.
Yeah.
So I think specialist takes a long time to develop.
Yeah.
I think drop-down days or off-timetable days, if they're the icing on the cake, that's great. But let's not kid ourselves. If we had a sports day every half term, that would be a PE curriculum. So I think there needs to be a balance between a planned and taught curriculum. I think we also need to have ready in our back pocket, if you like, when there is when the next terrorist atrocity happens, or when something happens in society, we need not just to plough ahead with our planned curriculum, but we need to be prepared to respond to that.
Absolutely.
And again, I think for secondary staff, just to take the time to listen to the students and what are the concerns.
I think that echoes with what Michelle said, just that comment at the bottom there. The curse of the expert ends up delivering, as in the teacher becoming the expert in, say, PSHE or a particular topic. And sometimes sometimes you're going on a journey, I suppose, with your students, because it may be a topic area that you're not familiar with. So actually, it's actually quite good for your professional development as a teacher as well. And everything harks back to, and I know I keep banging on about this, but Mary Myatt saying that we are humans first and students second, or we're humans first and teachers second. So from that point of view, or professional second, actually having that connection and through that creating that safe environment so people can actually have those conversations. And I think that's where people's confidence levels drops, I think, because I think when I don't know where it's going to go, because as a teacher you tend to have everything mapped out for you, but with something like PSHE, you don't know what sensitivities you're going to hit, and you don't know where the conversations are going to go. So I suppose there's a reluctance to even enter into that room of discussion. So it's how do we as school leaders, I suppose, equip our staff so that they're able to have that confidence to create that safe environment. And they are emotive topics, some of these, especially the ones that you highlighted to do with the troubling times that we may have ahead. We've got two very emotive issues. One to do with I'm glad that you used the word post-COVID, because that gives us a future.
Nice to think there is.
I like that nod, but that's there is going to be a post-COVID, whichever way we look at it, whatever that looks like, and also with the raising of awareness again of whether it's Black Lives Matter or the inequalities that we face in our society. So I think they are difficult topics to deal with, and I think region by region, school by school, they'll have different emphases and different challenges to discuss, I think. Okay.
I'm just looking at one of the questions here about, but most people accept the answer, you won't be discussing anything personal, but take your silence as admission of guilt. I think we need to, at the start of the year or the start of a module, and we probably need to remind the students of this, is to say, look, guys, we're not going to be talking about personal stuff. I'm not going to. And yet, as you suggest, I think there are times where teachers do need to own that statement that I think racism is wrong. I think homophobic and transphobic comments are wrong. And I will not allow bullying to happen in my school, or we will address that quite robust.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it's a conversation to be had with students, to be just saying things like, look, we're not going to talk about personal stuff. We need to perhaps model somebody, I've read, I've seen, I've heard, somebody I know. Now, whether that's me or not is not the point. And I think also with things like, let's take sexuality or contraception, it's really important we defer those things to the third person. But even something like healthy eating, if you want to make a disclosure about you don't like the broccoli, well, be bold, make that statement. But I think it's really important we manage that appropriately. And that's about setting a climate or an expectation and then being prepared to say, well, that's a fair enough question, but, I'm not going to answer that from a personal point of view. I actually think that's starting to then impinge on somebody's personal space.
Yeah. So
we need to manage those expectations.
Yeah. As I said, that's born out of confidence, one in the topic areas, but also, as I said, because we're dealing with emotive topics quite often in PSHE, which means they're all lived experiences to some degree for all of us. And as teachers, we'll have more lived experiences and more things to pull on. That there's that danger that, but I think you're absolutely right. The issue is the thing that we need to discuss, not the person. There's more questions coming through now, so I just noticed.
Always the way.
Always the way. So where do you want to jump to next?
I do think it's important we talk about assessment. So I think the easy bit is to assess knowledge. And we know that we've got a curriculum which is based on knowledge. But actually enabling me to spell gonorrhea, you could have a go at teaching me that. But that's not the most important part. That's not the bit that's going to keep me safe. Having said that, we can't make informed pro-social, pro-health decisions if we've got inaccurate knowledge. So there does need, I think, to be a component around that. But I think we also need to think about how do we develop skills and some of the virtues, they call them in the DFE guidance, the honesty, the integrity, the trust, and so forth. I think there are some bits that we shouldn't try to assess. Having said that, and simply because it just gets too big, so has your child got age-related empathy is a bit of a nonsense question. But I think there are really powerful opportunities where we do develop that discussion. It might just be as simple as we're going to start our unit on whatever it is we're going to be talking about. Just on one side of a piece of paper, just jot down what does healthy eating or contraception or whatever it is we're discussing, what does it mean to you now? Let's put that piece of paper away and we'll do our unit, our 3 weeks, our half-term project on whatever it might be, and then we come back to that piece of paper and I review my own learning. So how have things changed for me? I think there's also a really important place for peer assessment. So for example, if as a teacher I'm going to set the class a challenge, which could be you've all got different bits of information that I want you to feedback and present. It's got to be 2 minutes long. Everybody in the group has to contribute. It's got to be audible, and ideally it would involve some technology as kind of broad examples of what we might try and do. And then the students can have those success criteria. So was it audible? Was it relevant? Did it address the points? And we can give them feedback. If group A is presenting, the other 4 or 5 groups can give them feedback on that. Along even just as simple as the 3 stars and a wish. What went well, and perhaps even better if. And for the reason I say that is also, I think, as you suggest, when it's not just about the issue. So there's the kind of vertical kind of knowledge-based stuff that we need to be conveying, but woven through that, the weft, if you like, would be things around developing those interpersonal skills, how to give and receive feedback, constructive feedback. How do I respond to that? If I'm one of the stars of the show and I'm quite happy to facilitate the whole group, blah, 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 that's great. But if I'm a quieter student, but I've still made a small but meaningful contribution, that should be recognized. Yeah. So I think there are ways both of looking at the content, but also developing the social skills through that, which are absolutely crucial to employability. Absolutely.
I think just as a skill, being able to, from a student's perspective, help them develop. I mean, the school that I'm at, we're developing oracy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the ability to be able to converse in an engaging way, but also to actively listen and re-engage. So all of those things, I think, go hand in hand, being able to deal with the issues. And I think that born out of that would be the confidence as a teacher, as somebody who's going to deliver this, that you can actually have healthy debates and that you can draw boundaries and you can navigate a topic in a way that it needs to be navigated without dampening it down or over controlling it. So I just want to jump to questions, just jump to the top of our list, if that's okay. I suppose this is where it came to the forefront a couple of years ago, and the debate still raging to some degree with the school in Birmingham, and this is a primary example, but I suppose it can apply to anything. So what Adam's asked, and he's the one that's actually on Twitter, so I think he's picked this up also from Twitter as well, but his personal experience. He said he's an SLE for the trust here, Chiltern Learning Trust, and we have very culturally and religiously diverse schools. Would you change your approach drastically depending on cohorts? Particularly our Luton schools are predominantly Muslim pupils, and this can have some sensitivities around it.
I would say yes, of course. I think on the one hand, I think we need to be quite clear that the law in this country is about that we don't discriminate against anybody with a protected characteristics, whether that's around race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation. And I appreciate that you may have your personal views on that, but the law in this country is very clear. Mm. Having said that, let's take something fairly innocuous like healthy eating. We know that some students from some families will find some types of food really, entirely unsuitable and abhorrent. But I think we need to recognise that. There's probably teaching that talks about why that might be. But we also need to recognise that other people will choose to eat other foods, and that will be okay. And you may have, I think one of the really exciting things about PSHE is that we're not dealing in absolutes. That some people will have if we're teaching, did Shakespeare say this, or that's the best way to answer this question in maths, those are fairly straightforward things. And then there comes a lot more creativity beyond that. But I think, for example, some people have very strongly held views around whether we eat meat, and other people have equally strong views about not eating meat. And we need to recognise that. We need to live with that nuance and that ambiguity. But then we're talking about some of our British values. Tolerance, I always feel, is slightly just tolerating something, but simply respecting and acknowledging diversity. I guess behind, particularly when we're thinking about some of the protests in Birmingham schools, predominantly Muslim pupils, but the same will be true of Catholic people. We have to recognise, and I think we should teach, that some adults will only have sex within marriage for the purpose of procreation, and we should respect that. And other people will have different views. And I think it's so important that we present our learning and engage the pupils in ways that are challenging and push the boundaries a little bit and get them to question and challenge, but at the same time are respectful to culture and are sensitive to faith needs. That even if we are teaching around the biology of adolescent development or of puberty or reproduction, then we need to be really sensitive about the diagrams that we use or single gender groups where necessary, simply because that will just be too uncomfortable to some people to recognise. Having said that, I think we can have a conversation about why is that difficult and how should we respond, and recognise that other people will have different views.
Can I just piggyback onto that? Just two things. Michelle's put a comment underneath. I'm interested in how to engage parents. So that in terms of what you've just discussed regarding changing your message, but also if we involve all stakeholders. So as a teacher, somebody who's going to deliver it, I'm also a stakeholder. So with reference to students, we can discuss in terms of there's the legalities behind it, there's a moral purpose, and being able to differentiate between the two and saying, well, in this country, this is what the legal requirement is. But on the other things, we can open it up. But as staff that are delivering it also may have similar objections, and also as parents. So how do we bring those parties on board? How does a teacher deliver something that goes against their moral compass? And how do we as schools engage with parents when we want to deliver something that may go against their moral compass?
All in 45 seconds. Yes.
Well, if you can, please, yes. I know that we can't go to the depth that we need to, but I think we have to address that because so much is student focused, but sometimes we forget that there are other parties involved.
Let's take those in reverse order. I think when we were talking about staffing, particularly in secondary schools, where the issues become more adult and more sharper in focus, if you like, I think it's really important that we should engage with staff with that process. So if we've got, let's say, 9 tutor groups across the and I'm really uncomfortable delivering aspects of this, particularly around contraception or whatever, are there, let's say, 3 staff who could deliver some of the stuff around sex and relationships in sex ed? Would 3 people be prepared to take on something possibly less challenging, like drugs education? And could 3 people do something around study skills? Not because they need to be equally robust, but because of their comfortableness. I would also say very strongly to staff, 6 months ago, I could have taught that unit on bereavement. Because of stuff that has happened in my life over the last few weeks, don't even ask me to go there, please. And I think it's so important that we maintain those conversations with staff and look after their well-being. And we need to be flexible and adapt to those needs. Coming on to our parents, I think it is really important that we have those conversations with parents. We need to recognise that whatever our faith, our young people swim in a sea of sexual messaging, sexual innuendo, half understood dirty joke, just listening to the radio. I wondered even about putting in, there's a nice little activity, you just kind of gradually reveal the lines on the words, and it's a song from Little Mix, and we all hum along to it, and it pervades our society, and yet the lyrics, I would suggest, are really questionable in terms of their morality and their the way it portrays relationships. So I think we need to talk to parents about those things. We need to engage with them to talk a bit about how this should be. We need to respect their right to withdraw from sex education if they choose to do so, anything that's outside the national curriculum. But I think it's really important we take them on the journey and we explain to them how and why we're going to teach this. We share some of the resources which hopefully have been developed, possibly with parent governors or parent groups or faith groups, to make sure that they're culturally sensitive and appropriate. And ultimately, again, we may just have to agree to disagree, that I respect your right to have those views. We've been asked to do this by the government for these good reasons. If you do choose to withdraw your child from sex education, we respect that. We will find them an alternative. I think I would also just question, if as a parent you're choosing to do this, how embarrassing might it be for your child to be the one who's excluded, or even a small group who's excluded? I think we need to manage that. I remember working with a Catholic school a few years ago who grasped the nettle around teaching contraception. And they had a wonderful deputy head who was just saying, look, we teach, this is the Catholic perspective, and this is why and how we think these things. We recognise that some Catholics will choose to use birth control, and this is some of the stuff that, so it's about presenting a balanced argument and encouraging young people to make up their minds with the support of their families and their faith and their culture, to recognise that those are really important things within people.
Absolutely. I think Stephen Huey just reminded us, who's on the age, said his last line, the old adage about it takes a village to raise a child, and the school is part of that village. And sometimes we forget that when we do discuss with the other stakeholders in the village, that we would get support. And because we're coming from a position of being open and transparent and not hiding or shirking away from that responsibility. So I think just to remind ourselves, especially with PSHE, and I think sometimes schools inadvertently just send out information, or a child go home and said, this is what we've discussed today, and that's the first that the parent will have heard about that. And I think that sometimes just shows a lack of empathy for the setting that your school is in, or you're oblivious to it in some way, that you haven't seen that coming and you weren't able to discuss that beforehand. But yeah, so I think we're just coming to the end of the session. I think it'd be really, really good to end up with Laura's question. It's almost like it's been half planted there, which I think is really good, because I think it needs to be addressed, because like we've talked about confidence levels, we've talked about the ability to deliver not just from a emotive point of view, but also from a technical point of view as well, to make sure that we do get the information correct to the students. So what she's asked is that we are moving to a lesson a week for each year group, which is great. But what's the best way for external speakers to get involved to raise factual information? Is this better for me as the lead to train staff?
It's a good question, isn't it?
Yes.
And I know a lot of primary schools, for example, will get terribly anxious towards the middle of June and say, oh my goodness, we need to get the nurse to come in and talk about puberty. And then the nurse comes in and does some sort of talk. Actually, I think we should encourage our primary staff to say, look, get the nurse in April or March and April and May, and encourage the staff to be able to talk about those things, to ask questions, so we can use our visitors to train staff. Visitors, I think, can enrich the curriculum hugely, and we should engage them. For example, if we have a speaker in from the GU Med, from the the Clinic for Sexually Transmitted Infections, because actually a teacher, I don't want to admit too much about my detailed knowledge of what happens in the sexual health clinic, because that might give the game away in all sorts of unfortunate ways. But so we can have an external speaker in. I think it's really important that when we engage our speakers, we're very clear about the messages that they are going to give and how they're going to do it. I think if we can have co-facilitation, so the teacher who knows the pupils, and actually, we shouldn't forget the extraordinary skills that teachers have to quiet this lot down without squashing them, to draw out this group by encouraging them. And yet the external speaker comes in with that kind of mantle of the expert. I think that's really important. What we mustn't have, I think, is that sort of, sometimes it happens on Radio 4, doesn't it, where we have a speaker with one fairly extreme view, let's say around pro-life, and they have another speaker in about pro-choice 10 days apart, and assume that that's some sort of balanced curriculum. I think it's really important that, I worry, for example, with a statutory RSHE comes on board, every faith group, every ex-user, everybody with a particular axe or angle to grind, sometimes with the very best of intentions, will be bombarding schools. We can come in and do this, we can come in and do that. And if a school does choose to have a speaker in, it's absolutely essential we talk to them about what is it they're going to say. We need to see the lesson plan. We need to see how their contribution fits into our wider curriculum, and make sure that it's in the best interest of the students. Yeah. The last thing I would say about that, Arvid, is I think, again, if we have a speaker coming in, whatever the content they're going to deliver, we can also say to our students, who's going to thank them for coming in? Who's going to tell them 3 things our class is proud of? If they're doing lots of talking, who's going to offer them a glass of water? So again, we've got not only the content, but we're developing the social skills or the presentation skills, which many children will get from home almost by osmosis, but can happen, I think, need to be taught as well. To build self-confidence and skills and employability. Yeah, absolutely. Just from a personal point of view, for those people that are listening today or watching on YouTube, having delivered PSHE as a professional has helped me to grow in ways that I hadn't actually envisaged, because it gives me a much more rounded vision of the student that I have in front of me. And also from the point of view that I'm a subject specialist in maths, but I get to have a conversation with my students not in a formal way, but as part of the school structure in a way, and it definitely does create different connections with your students. So it can be challenging, and I think from a confidence point of view, it can be daunting, but definitely it's very enriching for all parties involved when it's done well. I would agree. I think teaching is, whatever we're teaching, it's all about relationships. If we think back to the teachers who motivated, loved, cared for us, inspired us, it was a lot about the relationship, and possibly the relationship that I can develop just having those conversations when traumatic or significant incidents happen in young people's lives. They know they've got a trusted adult that they can refer to, is absolutely crucial for their emotional well-being, for their mental health, or possibly for their UCAS application. Absolutely. Right the way through the spectrum of all age groups. Thank you, John. A brilliant session. And I know, as I said, I think this one will be shared and will be used, because I think it's a really good one-stop, quick, as you said, fitting so much into that half-hour presentation, but the discussions afterwards as well, I think have been really enlightening in terms of how we approach this whole area within our schools. So thank you, John, for everything that you've put together for us today. I really appreciate it. Excellent. Thank you, Arvid. It's been lovely. It's just very briefly, one last question. I think somebody's talking about how do we take advantages. We're all teachers of children, young people. We're all doing it every day. Even just practicing some of the phrases like, that's a great question, but I'm going to have to think about that for a couple of minutes before I blurt out the first answer that comes in my head. I think just rehearsing and practicing those questions, those responses, the professional responses, are absolutely crucial. Thank you, and be delighted if people want to get in touch. Be very happy to talk.
Brilliant. I know you're active on Twitter as well. If you can just post any links that you feel are going to be useful to do with contacts or to do with anything that you've discussed today, I think that would be really, really helpful. As I said, thank you so much. I think it's an undervalued part of the curriculum, but it definitely has it punches above its weight when it's done well. So thank you so much. So that's another session of hashtag LDeduchat, leadership development in education online over with. I hope you've enjoyed this session as much as I did. I'm always learning something new, which is always my mantra to move forward. Just before we do slip off, what I'd like to do is just to remind those people that didn't see the intro this morning. We've got this session coming up on Thursday, and it's between 11:30 and 1 o'clock. It's a different time slot. It's a longer time slot, and we're looking at Black Lives Matters, anti-racism, a whole school responsibility, with a whole host of outstanding leading experts within the field of curriculum and leadership to do with this issue. Or we'll be sending you out the link for that. So please look out for that today, and do register with that directly onto Zoom, not available via Eventbrite. We're getting you straight into the Zoom registration for this session, and the spaces are limited, and we are expected to have a full turnout for this one. So please, please, please do join us on Thursday if you're able to. And somebody did ask, are we recording this session on Thursday? Yes, we are, and it will be made available, but the live discussion on Twitter and on the webinar will be a fascinating time to be present. So that's on Thursday, but just a reminder for the other sessions that we've got tomorrow, we have Chris Nichols looking at coaching, and again, something that's really dear to my heart in terms of developing staff and how do we move them forward in their aspirations. And then on Friday, we have Daniel Connor and Mark Mailer, who'll be looking at embedding a reading culture, especially coming from Chiltern High School for Boys, where they both are, which is a challenge in itself when you're trying to get boys to read, that old cliche. But they've done it, and they're going to be discussing it with you on Friday. So a brilliant week ahead. Do head on over to our Twitter handle at Chiltern TSA. At Chiltern TSA, follow us. More information will be coming out over the next day about our Thursday session. This is me, Arv Kaushal, signing off for another session of hashtag LDeduchat, leadership development in education online. I shall see you soon. Thank you.